In the heart of Africa's wild plains, a starving lioness came face to face with two helpless fawns, prey she should have devoured in seconds. But what happened next defied every law of nature. Instead of killing, she protected them, even against her own kind. As predators closed in, one impossible decision changed the savannah forever. Was it instinct or something far deeper, compassion? This is the story that shook the world of wildlife. Stay with us to witness a moment so powerful it will redefine what you believe about the wild and about the true meaning of strength. The first light of dawn spilled across the vast plains of the Masai Mara, a slow golden tide crawling over the horizon. The air was still, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of wildebeests and the whisper of wind through acacia trees. It was the kind of morning that seemed eternal until nature decided to rewrite its own laws. Far from her pride, a lone lioness named Zara moved like a ghost through the tall grass. Her ribs showed faintly beneath her tawny coat, each step a quiet struggle between hunger and exhaustion. She had once ruled beside a powerful male, raising her cubs under the protection of the pride. But the wild had no mercy for the weak or the grieving. After losing her litter to a rival lioness, Zara had been driven out, forced into exile and solitude. 3 days had passed since her last kill. Hunger gnawed at her like a second heartbeat. This morning she wasn't hunting for sport or territory. She was hunting to survive. Through the shimmer of heat rising off the plain, her eyes caught movement. Two small shapes huddled together in the grass. She froze. Her body sank, low muscles coiling with instinctive precision. The shapes were delicate, spotted, barely moving. Fawns. Two of them pressed close, the sunlight glinting off their tiny ears. Zara's breath quickened. They were too still to have a mother nearby, too vulnerable to last much longer alone. To a starving predator, this was a gift from the savannah itself. She crept closer, every motion soundless, her amber eyes locked on the trembling forms ahead. This was what she was made for: silent, decisive death. Nature's law was simple: the strong survive, the weak feed them. Yet as she reached striking distance, something deep within her stirred and stopped her cold. The fawns didn't run. They didn't even lift their heads. One of them gave a faint twitch, its sides heaving with shallow breaths. Their scent filled the air: fear, weakness, innocence. It struck her harder than hunger ever could. Zara's paw, raised to deliver the killing blow, trembled midair. She lowered it slowly, uncertain. For the first time in her life, instinct and memory collided. A faint cry, no louder than the wind, echoed through her mind. The cry of her lost cubs. She remembered their tiny bodies, their helpless mewling as they pressed against her for warmth. She remembered returning one day to find silence where life had been. The memory tore through her like claws. The fawns shifted, the smaller one trying weakly to stand. Zara stepped forward, her shadow spilling over them. The younger fawn froze, its wide eyes meeting hers. They were mirrors of pure fear, and yet behind that fear there was something else: a surrender, a quiet acceptance of fate. Zara exhaled. Her muscles, once tight with the thrill of the hunt, loosened. She lowered her head, bringing her nose within inches of the tiny creatures. The smell was unfamiliar, yet hauntingly tender. She expected them to bolt. They didn't. Instead of striking, she touched one lightly with her muzzle, a gesture so gentle it almost seemed human. The fawn shivered but didn't move away. Somewhere miles away, a field biologist named Ethan Cole adjusted the focus on his binoculars. From the shadow of his Jeep, he watched the scene unfold in disbelief. He had been documenting predator behavior in the Mara for nearly a decade. What he saw through the lens made his blood run cold. The lioness wasn't killing. She was watching, studying, almost thinking. Ethan muttered to himself, "No way. That's not possible." He began recording. The camera zoomed in just as Zara leaned down again, brushing her rough tongue across the back of one fawn. It flinched but didn't flee. The motion wasn't one of aggression, it was one of care. She licked again, slower this time, removing dust and flies from its coat. The sunlight caught on her whiskers, turning her face to gold. Ethan's breath caught. In 20 years of studying the wild, he had seen mercy among elephants, loyalty among wolves, even grief among dolphins. But this was something different. This was an apex predator acting in direct contradiction to everything evolution dictated. Zara circled the fawns, her tail swishing softly. She lay down beside them, curling her massive frame around their tiny bodies. The grass swayed gently, hiding them from view. Her breathing slowed, matching theirs. She wasn't guarding a meal. She was guarding life. Ethan whispered into his voice recorder, his words barely audible. A lioness is protecting prey. This shouldn't be happening. The camera captured every detail, the rise and fall of Zara's chest, the fawn's cautious stillness, the way her eyes softened as she looked down at them. For a moment, the savannah seemed to hold its breath, unsure if it was witnessing a miracle or madness. Zara stayed motionless, her body forming a living wall between the fawns and the open plain. The sun climbed higher and flies buzzed lazily through the air. From somewhere far off came the faint call of a vulture. Death was always watching, waiting for nature to resume its rhythm. But nature in that fleeting moment had been interrupted. A shift in the wind carried the scent of something else: hyenas. Zara's head lifted sharply. Her ears twitched, her muscles tensed. The fawns stirred beneath her, sensing her unease. Her eyes scanned the distance, finding nothing yet seeing everything. The spell of peace was about to break. Ethan saw it too through his lens, the slight twitch of her tail, the way her breathing deepened. He knew predators well enough to recognize that tension. Yet even as danger loomed, Zara didn't abandon the fawns. She pressed herself lower, widening her stance, ready to protect. It was a sight so contradictory, so powerful, that Ethan found himself whispering, why them? Why now? But there was no answer. Only the wind sweeping across the golden plain, carrying the scent of fear and the faint pulse of something ancient, the rebirth of compassion in the heart of a predator. And somewhere in that vast silence, as the first hyena cry echoed across the horizon, the wild held its breath again. Something extraordinary had begun, something that would defy the oldest rule of life and death in the savannah. The heat deepened as the sun climbed higher over the Masai Mara, spilling its fierce brilliance across the open plain. The air shimmered like liquid glass. Every living thing sought shelter, but Zara did not move. Her great frame remained poised over the two fawns, her golden fur glinting with sweat and dust. The cubs of her past, the ones lost to the cruelty of the wild, were gone, but in their absence something else had awakened within her, something gentler and infinitely more complicated. Ethan Cole sat half hidden in the shadow of his vehicle, his camera lens fixed on the scene before him. He had seen predators feed, fight, and die countless times, but never this. Every instinct told him to stay quiet, to simply observe, yet his heart felt as if it had been caught between two worlds: the analytical realm of science and the raw pulse of something profoundly human. Through his binoculars, he could see the smallest movements, the rise and fall of Zara's chest, the tremble of the fawns' delicate bodies as they pressed close against her side. It was a picture that didn't belong in nature, a contradiction written in muscle and fur and fragile trust. A warm gust of wind rolled over the plain, bending the tall grass. Zara blinked against the sun, her breath heavy, her sides moving with effort. She had not eaten in days, and yet she refused to leave the small creatures now sleeping beneath her. Hunger clawed at her from within, urging her to act, to restore the balance that nature demanded. But her body and her heart were no longer united in purpose. Something inside her had shifted, an instinct had been silenced by something stronger. The smaller fawn stirred, letting out a faint whimper, barely audible above the whisper of wind. Zara responded instantly. She bent her head and brushed her muzzle against its flank, emitting a low rhythmic hum, a sound known only to mothers. The fawn quieted its trembling, stilled by the strange comfort of the creature who should have been its killer. Ethan felt a pressure in his chest he couldn't quite describe. "She's comforting them," he whispered into his recorder. "She's not confused. She's choosing." His voice faltered. "God, she's choosing not to kill." It was the kind of realization that left no room for logic. No scientist could measure what he was witnessing. Compassion didn't fit into data sheets or research graphs. It existed in moments like this, raw and trembling, a truth beyond the boundaries of instinct. The lioness shifted her body, lowering herself fully to the ground so the fawns could rest against her. Her tail flicked lazily through the grass, not in agitation, but in calm. The younger fawn's head rose, resting tentatively against her foreleg. Zara did not move. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled the sound like a sigh of surrender. For a long while, the world seemed to hold its breath. The savannah, normally a symphony of conflict and survival, grew quiet. The birds fell silent. Even the distant hum of insects seemed muted, as if nature itself paused to bear witness. Ethan could no longer hide behind the safety of scientific detachment. His heart ached with something deeper than fascination. It was reverence. He thought of the people he'd met who claimed that mercy was weakness, that survival was the only truth. But here before him was proof of something else, strength shaped by empathy. The kind of strength that could stop a predator mid-hunt, rewrite instinct, and redefine courage. The lioness opened her eyes again, scanning the horizon. Her ears twitched. She sensed the movement of life and danger beyond the tall grass. The savannah was watching her, and in its gaze was judgment. Yet she remained unmoved. She lowered her head once more, letting the fawns curl into the soft space beneath her chest. They slept there, their breathing soft and uneven, the faint rhythm of their hearts pressed against the heartbeat of the lioness who had chosen not to take theirs. Time passed slowly. The heat softened into a golden haze as afternoon approached. Ethan shifted his position, his knees stiff from crouching. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was low and reverent. "I've seen a lioness kill for her pride, for her cubs, even out of mercy to end suffering. But this is different. This is something we don't have a word for." He thought of the years he'd spent studying the wild, believing he understood its order. Every kill he'd documented, every cycle of predator and prey had built his understanding of balance. But watching Zara now, he realized that balance wasn't built only on death. It was also built on moments like this, when life chose to protect itself against its own nature. The camera caught the smallest details, the glint of sunlight on Zara's whiskers, the slow flutter of her eyelids, the way her paw curved protectively around the fragile shape of one fawn. She was no longer the hunter. She was a guardian. When one of the fawns awoke and stumbled to its feet, unsteady and weak, Zara's head lifted in concern. The young creature pressed its nose against her paw, as if to test the boundaries of trust. Instead of reacting with predatory reflex, Zara merely nudged it gently back toward the safety of her body. Ethan swallowed hard. The gesture was so tender it nearly hurt to watch. He reached for his water canteen and stopped halfway, realizing his hands were shaking. "It's empathy," he murmured. "Real empathy. She knows they're fragile and she's protecting them because she understands." His throat tightened. How does she understand? The scene unfolded with a quiet poetry that no one could script. The sun began to tilt westward, throwing long shadows over the plain. Zara lifted her head to the horizon, her expression unreadable. Somewhere beyond the golden expanse, danger was always moving closer. She knew it, yet she stayed. For a fleeting instant, Ethan imagined what it must feel like to stand alone against instinct, to rewrite the oldest law written into your blood. The lioness wasn't denying her nature. She was redefining it. And in that defiance, there was beauty. The fawns stirred again, one nestling closer, the other resting its head against Zara's leg. The lioness tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening. The wind swept through the grass, carrying with it a whisper of something eternal, the faint hum of compassion threading through the chaos of survival. As the light began to fade, Ethan turned off his camera. There were moments that didn't need to be filmed, moments too sacred for documentation. He leaned against his vehicle, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the lioness, cradling her unlikely children beneath the setting sun. He didn't know how long this fragile peace would last, or what would come when hunger returned or predators arrived. But in that suspended sliver of time, he understood something profound. The wild was not just a place of brutality, it was also a place of grace. And somewhere in that grace, a starving lioness had found something even rarer than food. She had found purpose. The serenity of the afternoon didn't last. Nature has always had its way of testing every fragile moment of peace. The stillness that had wrapped around the lioness and the two fawns began to unravel when the wind changed direction. It carried with it a scent, one that made every creature on the savannah hold its breath. Hyenas. Their laughter came first, faint and distant, carried over the grasslands like an omen. It was the sound of chaos disguised as joy, a cruel reminder that the wild had no regard for miracles. Zara's head lifted instantly. Her ears twitched muscles, tensing beneath her golden coat. The fawns stirred beneath her, their small bodies trembling against her side. Hunger had dulled her strength, but instinct, protective, primal, unrelenting, returned like fire in her veins. She rose slowly, scanning the horizon. The sun was sinking now, bleeding red light into the air, and in that crimson glow, shadows began to move. Ethan Cole crouched behind the wheel of his Jeep, lifted his binoculars. His stomach twisted as he counted the shifting shapes, 5, maybe 6 hyenas, moving in a half-circle formation, their low bodies weaving through the grass like ripples of oil. He had seen what they could do, how they worked together with ruthless efficiency. Alone, a lioness could fend them off. But a starving lioness, already weakened, protecting 2 defenseless fawns, that was a death sentence. He reached for his radio static hissing through the receiver, but the signal was too weak. His heart pounded as he whispered, "Hold on, Zara. Just hold on." On the plain, the hyenas emerged into view, their yellow eyes gleaming with malicious curiosity. They weren't in a rush. They never were. Hyenas like to test their prey. First probe, intimidate, provoke. Their laughter grew louder, echoing across the empty expanse like a cruel chorus. Zara lowered her head, her lips curling into a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the roar of a hunt. It was the sound of warning of a boundary drawn in the sand. The fawns pressed themselves closer to her legs, one letting out a soft bleat that carried a desperate note. The noise drew the hyena's attention, like blood in the water. One broke formation, darting forward with a mocking bark, snapping its jaws before retreating again. Zara didn't move. Her eyes followed every motion, calculating distance and intent. Ethan's camera trembled in his hands. Every frame he captured told the same impossible story. A predator turned protector, standing between life and death, not for her kind, but for another's. "She's not backing down," he murmured. "She knows she can't win, but she's not backing down." Another hyena lunged. Zara reacted with lightning speed. Her paw struck the ground with a force that sent dust erupting into the air. The blow caught the hyena across its shoulder, sending it tumbling backward in a yelp of surprise. She didn't chase. It wasn't about dominance. It was defense measured and deliberate. The pack regrouped, circling tighter, now emboldened by their numbers. Their leader, a scarred female with a shredded ear, barked orders in short, sharp bursts. The air thickened with the scent of tension. Zara's breath came heavier now, her sides heaving. Her eyes darted between the fawns and her enemies, her mind torn between retreat and defiance. There was nowhere to run. The open plains offered no shelter, no escape. The only choice was to stand her ground. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "She's going to fight them," he whispered. "She's actually going to fight for them." The first real charge came without warning. 2 hyenas lunged from opposite sides, their claws cutting through the dust. Zara spun, swiping her massive paw in a wide arc. The impact was brutal. One attacker crumpled under the blow. The other narrowly dodged, snapping at her hind leg as it passed. A deep snarl tore from her throat, shaking the air itself. The fawns ducked low, huddled together in the shadow of her body. For every strike she landed, the hyenas pressed harder. They moved with a soldier's precision, testing, retreating, returning. One managed to clamp its jaws briefly onto her flank. Zara roared, twisting violently, the sound tearing across the savanna like thunder. She struck again, this time with raw power, and the hyena fell limp, retreating with a whimper. But blood now streaked her fur, a thin line of crimson across gold. Ethan's breath quickened. He wanted to intervene, to start his vehicle and drive toward her, but instinct told him not to. The wild had its own rhythm, and human interference might shatter something sacred. He could only watch. Zara was tiring. Each breath came shorter now, each movement slower. The hyenas sensed it. Their laughter rose again, sharp and mocking. The scarred leader crouched low, ready for the next assault. She would go for the fawns next. Ethan could see it in her eyes. Then something extraordinary happened. Zara did not retreat or lash out. Instead, she stepped over the fawns, completely shielding them with her entire body. Her paws dug into the dirt, her tail flicked once in defiance, and her chest rumbled with a low, rhythmic growl. Not rage, but a declaration. Ethan could feel it even from a distance. It wasn't the sound of violence. It was the sound of devotion. The lioness was telling the world that if the fawns were to die, they would have to die through her. For a moment, even the hyenas hesitated. The silence that followed was eerie, broken only by the hiss of the wind. The scarred leader tilted her head, eyes narrowing, uncertain. Zara's gaze met hers, steady, fearless, ancient. Ethan whispered into the silence, "She's not afraid. She's not even fighting for herself." The standoff stretched fragile and infinite. The hyenas, confused by the absence of fear, began to waver. One barked, testing the air. Another shifted uneasily. And then, as if guided by some invisible signal, the pack began to retreat slowly at first, then all at once, slipping back into the tall grass, their laughter fading into the distance. Zara remained motionless long after they had gone. Her sides rose and fell heavily, her eyes fixed on the horizon. When she finally turned her head, the fawns were still there, pressed close, their small bodies trembling but alive. Ethan lowered his camera, his vision blurred with tears he hadn't realized he was holding back. He had seen courage before among soldiers, among rescuers, even among his colleagues, but never like this. This was courage stripped of reason, born of something purer than thought. It wasn't about victory or survival. It was about choosing to protect life, even when it offered nothing in return. As the last light of day bled into the horizon, Zara collapsed gently beside the fawns, her head lowering to the ground. Her breathing was shallow but steady. The fawns moved closer, their tiny bodies finding warmth against hers. Ethan watched in silence. The test had come brutal and unforgiving, and yet in defiance of everything, the wild demanded Zara had passed it. Not through dominance, not through strength alone, but through something far rarer, through love disguised as instinct and courage, born from compassion. The Masai Mara had gone quiet after the chaos. The hyenas were gone, their cruel laughter swallowed by the distance, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of breathing, one deep and ragged, the other small and trembling. The sun dipped lower, painting the savanna in soft hues of amber and blood orange. Zara lay still, her muscles quivering from exhaustion, her fur streaked with dust and thin trails of crimson. The fawns huddled close to her belly, their bodies pressed against her warmth, as though instinctively knowing that the safest place in the world was beside the creature that should have been their doom. Ethan Cole sat in his Jeep, staring through the lens of his camera, but forgetting to hit record. He had been silent for hours now, afraid to break the fragile stillness of the scene before him. What he was witnessing wasn't just survival, it was something far greater, something that blurred the line between instinct and emotion. The lioness was no longer just a predator. She had become a guardian, her defiance of nature, no longer a momentary act, but a commitment written in blood and breath. As the sky deepened to gold, Zara slowly lifted her head. Her body ached, every movement deliberate and heavy. Her golden eyes scanned the horizon. There was always another danger. In the wild, safety was never permanent. Yet she didn't move to leave. She turned her gaze downward, checking on the two fawns. One stirred, its delicate legs twitching as it shifted closer, while the other let out a faint, almost questioning cry. Zara lowered her muzzle and pressed it softly against the small creature's side. The sound that followed wasn't a growl, it was a hum, low and deep, the sound a mother makes to calm her young. Ethan felt his chest tighten. It was as if she had adopted them. The idea was absurd yet undeniable. She was communicating not through words but through gestures older than speech itself. He whispered to himself, "She's teaching them she's safe." Hours passed. The light faded into twilight and a cool wind swept over the plain. Zara stood finally, her massive frame rising above the grass, casting a long shadow over the two fawns. Her head turned once more toward the horizon where thunderclouds began to build. The scent of rain was sharp in the air. The fawns stumbled to their feet unsteady, but determined, their legs awkward beneath them. Zara began to move slow but purposeful, pausing every few steps to glance back, ensuring the tiny creatures followed. Ethan followed from a distance in his vehicle, the engine barely above a whisper. He didn't want to interfere, didn't want to taint the purity of what he was seeing. He simply watched as the lioness led the two fawns through the tall grass, her tail swaying slowly like a signal of reassurance. She moved with purpose, guiding them toward the ridge, where acacia trees stood silhouetted against the setting sun. When the rain finally came, it arrived as a soft drizzle that turned the dry earth into a mirror of liquid gold. Zara found a small cluster of rocks at the edge of a shallow ravine and settled there, curling her body once more around the fawns. The rain darkened her fur, but she didn't move. She shielded them, letting the water roll off her broad shoulders while the fawns pressed their heads beneath her neck for warmth. Ethan lowered his camera and sat back overcome. He wasn't just witnessing a behavioral anomaly. He was witnessing the collapse of a boundary that had existed since the dawn of time. A predator protecting prey, not for gain or survival, but from something that resembled empathy, perhaps even love. He remembered his mentors back in the lab who always said nature was heartless, that compassion was a human invention. Looking at Zara, he realized how wrong they'd been. Night fell slowly and the savannah came alive with sound, the chorus of crickets, the distant roar of a lion pride, the echoing calls of jackals. Yet in the hollow between those sounds where danger and peace intertwined, the small family, unnatural, improbable, slept. When dawn came, it did so softly. Ethan had fallen asleep behind the wheel, and when he awoke, the world was painted in gold again. Zara was still there, her breathing steady, her head resting on her front paws. One of the fawns stood a few feet away, nibbling uncertainly on the grass, while the other remained nestled against her. The sight was so gentle, so peaceful, that for a brief moment, the harshness of the wild felt like a distant myth. Then a rumble in the distance shattered the illusion. Ethan turned toward the sound, his binoculars rising automatically. On the far side of the plain, figures moved through the haze of the morning. Lions, 7, maybe 8 of them, walking in formation. A pride. His heart dropped. The balance of this strange sanctuary was about to break again. Zara lifted her head. She smelled them before she saw them. The wind carried their scent, familiar, dangerous, inescapable. She stood slowly, her body taut with awareness. Her tail flicked once, twice. The fawns, sensing her tension, pressed themselves close to her legs. Ethan gripped his camera, his pulse pounding. The pride approached their steps, deliberate, their golden coats shining in the sun. The leader, a large male with a dark mane, moved at the front. Behind him were lionesses, sleek and strong. They were hunting. Ethan knew what would happen next. They would smell the fawns, see Zara as competition and attack. The wild knew no sympathy for misplaced loyalties. But Zara didn't move. She didn't run, didn't roar. She simply stood there, her body forming a barrier between the newcomers and the 2 trembling fawns behind her. Her eyes locked with the male lions across the distance. There was no fear there, only a quiet, defiant calm. Ethan whispered to himself, "She knows them. They're from her old pride." It made sense, the scent, the familiarity. She had once been one of them, but exile had changed her, shaped her into something different. Now, as the pride drew nearer, she didn't lower her gaze or submit. She held her ground. The lions slowed, confused. The male's ears flicked, his expression uncertain. He growled low, a rumble that vibrated through the ground. But Zara didn't answer. Instead, she looked down once more at the fawns and then back at the pride leader, her body language clear, a silent plea, or perhaps a warning. Ethan's hands trembled as he adjusted the focus. The standoff stretched on tension, thick enough to taste. Then unexpectedly, one of the lionesses behind the male stepped forward. Her gaze softened as it fell on Zara, then on the fawns. There was something in her posture, hesitation and recognition, understanding. She growled softly, not in threat, but in acknowledgement. Zara's head tilted. For a long moment, the 2 lionesses simply stared at one another, 2 mothers divided by circumstance, yet united by something older than instinct. Then slowly the approaching pride began to move again, but not toward attack. The male turned first, leading them away, the others following one by one, their tails flicking like ghosts through the golden grass. Ethan exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath. He lowered his camera and let the silence wash over him. Against every rule of nature, against the brutal order of the wild, peace had been granted, once again, not through power, but through understanding. Zara looked back at the fawns. One blinked up at her, tilting its head as though waiting for a signal. She lowered herself beside them, once more her body curved in quiet victory. Ethan whispered into the still air, "It's not about species anymore. It's about heart." And in that moment, as the rising sun caught the dew on the grass and painted the world in light, It was impossible not to believe that the wild itself had chosen just for a breath of time to be kind. The storm that had brewed across the Masai Mara passed as swiftly as it came, leaving behind a cleansed stillness. The sky glowed with the soft blue of dawn streaked with pink and silver, and the air smelled of wet earth and renewal. For the first time in days, the plains seemed to breathe again. The chaos of the hunt, the cries of predators and prey, the endless struggle for survival, all of it faded into a quiet rhythm of peace. Zara moved through the tall grass with a slow, deliberate grace. The rain had washed away the blood from her coat, revealing once more the shimmer of gold beneath the morning light. Her movements were lighter now, her exhaustion tempered by something unspoken, an awareness that she had not just survived, but changed. The two fawns followed closely, their steps tentative, but determined, no longer trembling with fear. Each time they stumbled, Zara paused, waiting patiently for them to find their balance. It was as if, in guiding them, she herself had learned to walk anew. Ethan Cole stood a short distance away, his camera hanging uselessly from his neck. For days he had documented every breath of this story, the defiance, the courage, the unthinkable bond. But now as he watched them under the awakening sky, he realized the camera was no longer needed. Some moments he thought weren't meant to be captured. They were meant to be felt. The lioness and the fawns reached a small rise overlooking the open savanna. Below them, the world stretched endlessly, dotted with acacia trees and shimmering puddles left by the rain. Zara paused at the crest, her silhouette outlined against the new light. The fawns pressed close to her legs, their coats glistening, their eyes wide with innocence and trust. For a long moment she stood motionless as scanning the horizon. The wind carried the scent of her old pride, the lions she had once belonged to, but also the faint fragrance of the unknown. She could return, perhaps, reclaim her place among them. But as she looked down at the fragile creatures beside her, she seemed to know that her path had changed forever. Ethan could sense it too. He leaned against his jeep, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Not the kind that came from logic or reason, but the kind born from witnessing something that defied every explanation. In the heart of one of Earth's harshest landscapes, a lioness had proven that compassion was not the opposite of strength, but its truest form. The fawns wandered a few steps away, nibbling at the fresh shoots of grass that had sprouted overnight. Zara watched them, her tail flicking softly. Her eyes, once fierce and haunted, now held a calmness Ethan could only describe as peace. The savannah was vast, the dangers endless, but for this fleeting moment all was right. Ethan finally lifted his camera, not to analyze but to honor. Through the lens he framed the image that would stay with him for the rest of his life, a lioness standing tall beneath the morning sun, her golden fur glowing like fire, her unlikely companions grazing beside her. The picture wasn't about survival, it was about rebirth. He whispered softly to himself, "This is what faith looks like." As the sun climbed higher, Zara began to move again, her powerful body cutting through the grass. The fawns followed smaller shadows in her wake. Each step they took left faint prints in the damp soil, marks that would soon fade, yet carried the weight of something eternal. They were walking toward the unknown, but they were not afraid. Ethan remained where he was, his eyes following them, until they disappeared into the horizon. The savannah swallowed them in light, as if the earth itself had accepted their story. He stood in silence, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and the pulse of something bigger than words. For the first time in years, he believed not in science or instinct, but in the quiet truth that lived between them. Life, he realized, was not built only on survival. It was built on choice, the choice to protect, to trust, to love beyond reason. And as the wind carried the last echo of Zara's footsteps across the plains, the Masai Mara seemed to whisper back a promise, that even in the wildest places, hope could still find a way to return. In the fading light of the Masai Mara, as the horizon dissolved into shades of gold and crimson, Zara's story became more than a tale of survival. It became a mirror reflecting the hidden depth of life itself. What unfolded before Ethan's camera was not merely an anomaly of instinct or behavior. It was a revelation of what connects all living things. The lioness, born of hunger and dominance, had chosen empathy over appetite, compassion over conquest. In doing so, she reminded the world that mercy is not weakness, it is courage in its purest form. This story challenges what we think we know about nature and perhaps about ourselves. In a world that often celebrates power and competition, Zara's choice to protect rather than destroy speaks to a truth long forgotten that the greatest strength lies not in domination, but in restraint. Her defiance of instinct reminds us that kindness, even when it costs us something, carries the power to transform. The two fragile fawns she saved may never understand what she sacrificed, but her act echoes beyond the plains. It whispers to every human heart willing to listen. Ethan's lens captured more than a moment. It captured a lesson. That empathy is not confined to humanity. It is an ancient language written into the soul of existence. The wild often perceived as merciless holds stories of grace for those patient enough to witness them. And perhaps that is what we are meant to take away from Zara's journey, that compassion is not rare, only overlooked. It exists in us in nature, in every choice to protect what cannot protect itself. When we look at the world through that lens, we see that love and understanding are not privileges of the civilized, they are the roots of survival itself. The lioness and the fawns did not just survive a single night in the wild, they survived the boundaries that divide species instinct and fear. And in doing so, they gave us a reason to believe again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that hope can be found even in the heart of the wild, then help us continue to share these extraordinary moments. Subscribe to our channel, share this story, and join us in celebrating the untold bonds that unite the living world. Together, we can keep these stories alive and remind everyone that compassion is still the wild's greatest strength.